In this video, I'm going to talk about how to create an outline. To do this, we are going to create a section of an outline together. Step 1 is to look at your course syllabus. To begin creating our outline, we're going to start by looking at an example of a law school syllabus. Your course syllabus gives you an overview of the material you will be covering in the course. On the screen, you can see the first few sections of a class syllabus for torts. In this syllabus, we see introductory issues, the negligence principle, which includes the elements of breach, the duty requirement for physical injuries, the duty requirement for non-physical harm, and causation. This syllabus also includes defenses, strict liability, product liability, intentional torts, defamation, and privacy-related torts, and intentional economic harm. You can see how the syllabus nicely breaks down all the components of the class. For your outline, you could use the headings in this syllabus to create the headings of your outline. In fact, you could take this syllabus and copy and paste it into a document and use that document to create your outline. Note that this is an actual course syllabus. A lot of law school syllabi are laid out in this manner. They tell you exactly what topics you will be covering in the course. If you use your syllabus to create your outline, note that you don't have to include every single thing that is in the syllabus in your outline. Also, you might want to move some things around and change the order of the topics sometimes. For example, you probably don't want to include class policies in your outline because you won't be tested on those. You might not even want to include the basic background information on the overview of types of torts. That might not need to go in your outline. And sometimes you might move things around. For example, negligence is broken down into 4 elements: duty, breach, cause, and harm. You will probably spend a long time talking about negligence in your torts class. As you can see, this torts professor certainly does. And in general, when analyzing a negligence problem using those 4 elements, you approach the elements in that order. So first, did the defendant have a duty? Did he breach the duty? And did it cause the plaintiff's harm? Here, this professor starts teaching about negligence by starting with breach, which is the second element of negligence. Then the syllabus goes on to discuss duty, which is the first element. Because the syllabus lists these issues a bit out of order, you might want to move this in your outline. You might want to move the section on breach so that it appears after the section on duty in your outline. Now, you might not realize this when you first look at your syllabus. In fact, you probably won't. You probably won't realize it until after your professor starts talking about negligence. But that is okay. The point here is that it is all right to go back and rearrange sections of your outline so that they appear in a more logical order. Step 2 is to add rules. For this step, I started with the intentional torts section of the outline, since most torts classes start with intentional torts. You can see the topics that the professor is going to discuss within intentional torts. First, they will discuss intent, then assault, battery, false imprisonment, and infliction of emotional distress. Then they will cover defenses to intentional torts. So, to start our outline, all I have done is copy and paste the section dealing with intentional torts into my outline document. Now, we need to insert the rules for each of these topics. The best place to get these rules is from your class notes. This is because your professor will usually state the rule or draw your attention to a resource where you can find the rule. For example, the rule might be in a case that you read or in the restatement. If your professor does not give you the rule or tell you where to find it, you will need to use other resources such as supplements, a tutor, Google, or a legal database to find the rule. You will need to know the black letter law to be able to succeed on the final exam, so it is important that you put the black letter law in your outline. Step 3 is to rewrite the rules in outline form. For example, under assault, we have written, the defendant acts with intent to cause a harmful or offensive contact, or an imminent apprehension of such contact, and an imminent apprehension directly or indirectly results. That is a lot to digest. It is also hard to memorize that rule the way we have it written. It is not easy for your brain to break that sentence up into different elements. So, we are going to rewrite this rule in a form that is easier to digest and memorize. You can see how we have broken up the long rule into 3 elements. The defendant acts with intent to cause a harmful or offensive contact or imminent apprehension of such contact, and an imminent apprehension directly or indirectly results. This is easier for your brain to digest and remember because the rule is broken up into 3 key elements: act, intent, and imminent apprehension. Even if you don't remember the rest of the rule word for word, you will be able to remember those 3 key elements. And that is important because that is what you are going to need to write on the exam. You can see that we have done this with each of the intentional torts. Step 4 is to add cases to the outline. As you go through the semester, add the cases into your outline that your professor spends time discussing in class. For example, you can see that there are several cases listed for reading under intentional torts: Garrett, Picard, Wisnowski, Lopez, and Womack. Starting with the Garrett case, this is a fundamental torts case that almost everyone reads in law school when studying intentional torts. Your professor may use this case to explain a couple of concepts. For example, they may use it to explain intent or battery or both. No matter how your professor uses the Garrett case, they are likely to spend a lot of time talking about it. So, this case should go in your outline. In contrast, if your professor spends only a few minutes talking about a case, that case probably does not need to go in your outline. For example, if your professor is discussing intentional infliction of emotional distress, and your professor assigned you 10 cases to read, but spends only about 2 minutes summarizing the cases as a group, you probably don't need to include all those cases in your outline. This is a clue that your professor does not think those cases are all that important. Many students wonder about whether they should include every case in their outline. Remember that cases are illustrations of the law. Think about when you were in math class working on story problems. You did not memorize the story problems because their purpose was to illustrate a mathematics principle. You learned the principle so you could apply it to other problems. Similarly, most professors do not want you to memorize the cases for the final exam, even though you are usually expected to know the details of cases for purposes of being on call. The purpose of cases is to show you how courts apply the rule of law that you are learning. So you do not need to include the entire case brief in your outline. If you do, your outline will be too long and complex for you to memorize. Instead, just include the name of the case and a couple of sentences explaining the case. Here, if your professor discusses the Garrett case in the context of battery, you would put that case in your outline under battery. If your professor talks about the Lopez case in the context of false imprisonment, you would put that case in your outline under the section on false imprisonment. You can see that what we have written is a short summary of the case. An employee will not recover for false imprisonment when she voluntarily accompanied her employer into a room where she was questioned. There were no threats and no physical force used. Just 2 sentences. This is an ideal summary of the case to put in your outline. It could even be shorter. The whole point of adding this case to your outline is to allow you to associate false imprisonment with this case and to have an example of how the court applied the rule. Step 5 is to add hypotheticals from class. This is an important step in creating your outline, but it starts with good note-taking. Some students, when the professor starts giving examples or hypotheticals in class, they stop taking notes. They think that because the professor is not telling them about the law or a case, it is not important to take notes on this information. But really, the opposite is true. The hypotheticals that your professor presents in class often represent what concepts your professor thinks are important and how they like to test them. For example, if your professor is talking about assault and presents the following scenario. Imagine that I have a black belt in karate and I'm a great, big, strong person. And then a small person comes up to me with his fist raised and says that he is going to punch me in the stomach. I am not afraid of this person because I am a big, strong person with a black belt in karate. Can I sue the small person for assault? The answer is yes. Even though I am not afraid of the small person, fear is not required for assault, just an imminent apprehension of a harmful or offensive contact. You can see that we have added this hypothetical to our outline because it is helpful to us to understand the imminent apprehension requirement for assault. And the professor might include a similar situation on an exam question. So, when your professor gives hypotheticals in class, write them down and then include a short summary of the hypothetical in your outline. Step 6 is to add any ambiguities in the law to your outline. For intentional torts, there really are not a lot of ambiguities, so we did not add any to this section of the outline. But for other topics, there will be situations where some courts say one thing and other courts say another thing. Or common law may say one thing and modern statutes say another thing. This can be unsettling for students because these rules contradict each other. It can be helpful to understand that this is the nature of the law and not let it worry you. Instead, you should put the different approaches to the law in your outline and memorize them because these are issues that professors frequently test. For example, your professor may test a rule that has more than one approach and expect you to apply both approaches to the facts. In this situation, you should state the first rule, apply that rule to the facts, and explain what the likely outcome would be under that approach. Then, do the same thing for the other rule and explain what the likely outcome would be under that approach. Professors like to test students' abilities to analyze different approaches to the law to the same set of facts. A final note on formatting and color coding your outlines. Some students like to keep their outlines plain without any highlighting or colored text. Other students like to use color, highlighting, or different colored text to help them memorize their outlines. For example, a student might highlight the rule in blue, bold key terms, highlight cases in yellow using italics font, and use red text for hypotheticals. There is no right or wrong approach when it comes to color coding or not color coding your outlines. I encourage you to experiment with different approaches to find what works best for you.